Welcome to Artwell. I'm your host, Jacob Kelly. My guest today is Howard Bloom, who was a music publicist in the 1970s and 80s, worked with clients like Michael Jackson, Prince, Bob Marley, Queen, Kiss, Aerosmith, AC/DC, Joan Jett, and more. In 1979, New York Magazine named him in their Hot 100 Plus list as one of its big deal makers. This is Howard's second appearance on the podcast. He was on the show back in 2023, where I interviewed him about his time in the music industry to try and understand what it meant to make someone a star.
So I got a call at 4 o'clock in the afternoon at my office on 55th Street near Lexington Avenue in Manhattan. And the voice on the other end of the phone said, "You've got to be out here at 11 o'clock tonight. Michael is canceling his tour. You're the only one he will listen to," meaning Michael Jackson. Went out to LA. I watched them finish their rehearsal, walked out to a dressing trailer, and Michael explained to me why he was canceling his tour.
When I reached out to Howard for this interview, I did so with the expectation of continuing our conversation about his time in the music industry. But when I emailed him, he replied to me and said that his new book, The Case for the Sexual Cosmos, Everything You Know About Nature is Wrong, was set to release, and he'd prefer to focus our interview around that. And while that may feel like a weird book for a former music publicist to release, if there's one thing you need to know about Howard, it's that you can't put him in a box. You see, he left the music industry in the late 1980s after suffering a debilitating illness that left him bedridden for many years. And after finally overcoming it in the early 2000s, he returned to his first love of science. And Howard believes, like Einstein believed, that in order to be an original scientific thinker, one must be a writer. And not a good writer, a great one. And so while an in-depth conversation with Howard about his scientific theories didn't necessarily make sense for this podcast, I was definitely still interested in exploring the process of a polarizing writer who is striving for greatness. And so now, without further ado, I am very excited to present to you my second interview with Howard Bloom.
Every human being, across all time and space, we've been hardwired for stories.
There are no breaks in this business. You make your breaks.
The reason I'm in this room right now is because my music's very dope.
Let's try to find something that people remember 20 years later.
Break rules. Leave the world more interesting for your being here. Make good art.
I was listening back to our previous interview earlier this week in preparation for this interview, and you said something that caught my eye, and I wrote it down. In the days when writers were scientists and scientists were writers. And I'm curious what you meant by that. I think you were in conversation about a German scientist in the 1800s, I believe, but I'm curious what you meant.
That was Alexander von Humboldt. And what I was talking about is that there were scientists like Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, Alexander von Humboldt, and they felt their obligation was to write clearly for a general, reasonably intelligent audience. And then a strange thing happened in 1810. Von Humboldt's older brother, older by 2 years, William, was asked to do a project for the Prussian government. And it was to allow the Prussians to get ahead in science of France, which was the leading scientific establishment of the time, and England, which was coming up second. So von Humboldt took a university, the University of Berlin, and set up something very strange. He set up 50% to be dedicated to the traditional liberal arts. And the other 50% will be dedicated to bringing in these people called natural philosophers and giving each one of them a lab and some grad students and requiring that newly minted professor be required every 6 months or so to turn out a piece of original research and get it published in the scholarly journals. And that was the beginning of what was called the Research University. And then over the course of the next 60 years, the professors pulled off a revolt, and they rebelled against the old school scientists, the scientists like Erasmus Darwin, who had been a doctor, and that's how he made his living. But that gave him lots of free time to ramble around the countryside, picking up specimens and speculating about things and reading Denis Diderot and people like that, the French guys who were putting together the first encyclopedia. And so over the course of time, these university professors basically, they devalued, they took the credibility away from the previous form of scientists, all of whom were allowed to dabble in as many disciplines as they wanted. as many as made them curious. And in the process, they started writing what's called hieratic prose. Hieratic prose is when you're writing prose for a priestly caste who has access to secrets the general public doesn't have access to. So they started writing in a priestly caste style of language, jargon, what we know today as scientific jargon. And their works became, for the most part, impenetrable to the general public. So that's what I'm talking about. I mean, the obligation to write clearly is something that I've taken very seriously since the age of 12. And if any of my work trips you up, if you have trouble understanding it, that's not your fault. That's my fault. And so one aspect of the craft, the way I handle it, is any paragraph of mine that you read, I've been over anywhere from 110 to 150 times, literally, making it clearer and clearer and clearer and giving it more zing, more pizzazz, more moxie.
Can you give like a tangible example of how to simplify a paragraph? Like when you're going over something that many times, like how are you simplifying it down? What does that look like?
Your first enemy is the complex sentence. So your first version of a sentence will be very long, will have a whole bunch of clauses in it, and will have a whole bunch of ideas packed into it that you were afraid would escape you if you didn't write them down immediately. And because none of those ideas are explained, they're incomprehensible to your reader. So the first step is to take long, complex sentences apart and look under the hood of each idea. And then lay that idea out in simple terms and back it with a story. Because any idea you cannot back with a story is useless to your audience. They won't get it. They'll forget it. But if you can engage them with a story that shows how this principle works, all of a sudden you've got a good chance of getting them by the gonads.
When you say with the story specifically, does it necessarily have to be a story directly related to the lesson you're teaching, or can it be allegorical or, again, the word is escaping me, but can it be not a one-to-one comparison, more like a story in a way to make it make sense to your audience?
Well, an allegory can sometimes be helpful, but it's better when you are trying to uncover an area of thought, and even worse, an area of thought that nobody has regarded it as an area of thought for a long time, to your reader. So the more stories you can get in that also help advance your narrative, that also help advance the big story underlying the book, the better.
So tell me about the first draft, I guess, because if eventually you're going to go over every single paragraph 100, 150 times, is that first draft, do you put any restrictions on yourself at all, or is it more so just getting as much of the information out as possible and the real writing is done in the refinement?
Oh, God, that's a very good question. I mean, this book began in, I think, 2010, when I was asked to give a lecture at New Paltz, at the State University of New York in New Paltz, New York. And I never give the same lecture twice. So I was contemplating, I had lunch with a major editor, and he didn't like the idea I presented to him. So I started spitballing ideas at him. And often those ideas, you don't know where they come from. You haven't really thought about them before, so far as you know. And they're taking shape right there at the lunch table. And one of the ideas was called the case of the consumerist cosmos. I wanted to show how the process of cosmic evolution, which means the evolution of the Big Bang, quarks, atoms, stars, galaxies, all of that, had been extraordinarily consumerist and extraordinarily materialist. So that idea picked up again in my head when I was offered the chance to speak at New Paltz. And I realized something. There are two laws in science that are just, everybody takes them for granted, period. And everybody in the scientific community will rush to their defense if they are ever attacked. And those laws are the principle of least action, which a guy named Pierre-Louis de Maupertuis, who was head of both the French Academy of Science, which was the leading academy of science of his day, and the Prussian Academy of Science, had come up with. And it's that it works off of a loose quote from Aristotle saying nature always takes the shortest path. And the other is the concept of the second law of thermodynamics, the concept of entropy. And entropy basically says all things are falling apart. It says that the number of ways in which something could be highly ordered, like a sugar cube in your hand or your glasses on your nose or even you, is incredibly improbable. And the number of ways that the universe could produce sheer randomness is infinite. As a consequence, the more probable will always happen. And I realized that isn't true. It's the least probable that always happens. And the perfect example is sex. Sex is anything but the shortest path between 2 points. It's not only the longest path between 2 points that this cosmos has ever managed to invent. It is so bizarrely complex that I'm sure you remember nothing of what you learned about it in high school. That a Mensa scholar who could spend, let's give him a month to study it, and then quiz him at the end of the month to make sure he understands it, then quiz him again a year later, most of it will have disappeared from his mind. It's just too bloody complex. Now, a cosmos that can work in such a tangled, extraordinary, intricate, who can invent that extraordinary, complicated, intricate system, is not exactly a cosmos that is always taking the shortest path. So that's where the book begun. And I finished a first version of it in something like 2014, and I wasn't satisfied with it. And then somebody said, you better write down your rock and roll memories before you forget them, because the stories are amazing. And so I started to, I set aside The Case of the Sexual Cosmos. I picked up what would later be called Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me. I discovered that whereas normally a good writer gets out about 250 words a day, and I was getting out something like 8,000 words a day on this rock and roll reminiscence. So that was going extremely fast. And then I had to put the book out. I had to find a publisher. And then I had to promote the book. And all of that took a total of, I don't know, 3 years or something like that. And then I came back to The Case of the Sexual Cosmos. And those years off were a blessing, because I could see The Case of the Sexual Cosmos in a whole new perspective. And that changed the nature of the book and the nature of the rhetoric in the book, because I am also violently opposed to dystopian thinking. And that opposition, that deep burning anger in me against dystopianism, underlay the motivation for the book too.
So walk me through the process then of coming back to The Case for the Sexual Cosmos 6 years later, however long it might have been, 3 to 6 years later, whatever that gap was. You're looking at it from a completely different perspective now. How do you take this thing that you had spent time on writing? You got to a quote unquote finished version. It wasn't the ultimate final product, but you completed the book.
Well, I have 14 chapters or something like that. A fairly good start.
So it wasn't the total book then, because the total book now is 50 chapters.
Wasn't the total book. But I didn't realize it wasn't the total book, because it had seemed reasonably complete, like just a matter of, who knows, 2 months to finish the whole thing. And it turned out it wasn't just a matter of 2 months to finish the whole thing. It was a matter of another 4 years or more, 6.
So how did you go about refining it?
Well, I went over what I had written, and I was dissatisfied. Often your dissatisfaction is an uchiness. That is, you can't articulate what is dissatisfying you, but you know something emotionally is not comfortable for you. And then over the course of the next year or two, you have to be able to put into words that inarticulate emotional discomfort. And it can take you going back to the same paragraph over and over and over again, as I said, 110 to 150 times, because you solve one problem, or you come an inch towards solving a problem that's 10 feet away. And it's still bothering you. And meanwhile, you're working on other parts of the book. And then eventually you go back to that paragraph that was bothering you, or that chapter that was bothering you, and you manage to articulate just a tiny bit more of what has made you uncomfortable, what has driven you. And the same thing happens over and over again for the next 4 to 6 years, as many as 4 to 6 years. And by the end, you've got a radically different book than you had in the beginning.
Describe to me that process of articulating that feeling, though, because I think that's the hardest part.
That's not easy, because you have, we talk with a metaphor of putting things on the slow burner or putting things on the back burner. And people used to keep a stew pot in the back of their stove. And they used to, when they'd had chicken, they threw in the chicken bones, and they chopped up some celery and carrots and a few onions and tossed it in there. They used those chicken bones to make chicken broth. And every time they had food waste that looked like it could be turned into something tasty, they threw it into the pot. And the pot could take forever and to turn out a usable stew, but you'd start dipping from it and throwing more stuff into it, and it would keep evolving. Well, sometimes it can take you 20 years to articulate a discomfort with something. For example, the first time I saw Elon Musk, this is before he became the Darth Vader, working with the Dark Emperor, the evil emperor. I was just struck. There's something in my gut. I learned this, I started in science, and eventually I took a dive into something I knew nothing about, popular culture and the rock and roll business. I knew nothing about this, Jacob. What the hell right did I have to go into this? Because one of the tasks of science is to understand everything. And I was heavily influenced by people like Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, who had gone into a tribe in Samoa and come to be so conversant in its lore and its rituals that they made her a chief. And she came from the United States, for God's sakes. So now I had an opportunity to do my own Samoa, to do my own equivalent of what Darwin had done with the Voyage of the Beagle, 5 years, exploring South America, riding with the gauchos, appearing in the office of a general who had just killed God knows how many men that day in a bloody civil war, and getting his permission, a piece of paper that said he had a free pass to go anywhere in that godforsaken country that he wanted. So I had that opportunity in the rock and roll world, and sure enough, like Margaret Mead, I became a chief. I became a well-recognized power broker in the rock and roll business. Well, I entered it in order to take a deep dive into the dark underbelly where new myths and movements are made. And I discovered during that time that there's some little thing in my gut that goes off. It's only gone off about a dozen times in my entire life. And it says, this is a superstar. So I was able to turn all of those people for whom I had this feeling into superstars. Well, when I saw Elon Musk, that same thing went off in my gut, except it didn't say superstar this time. Remember, one of the things I was after was myths, not just new movements, not just new rock and roll sensations. And the thing that went off in my gut said, this is a mythic figure. Kids will be following his example 115 years from now. Of course, little then did I know what monstrous things Elon Musk would someday do with Doge. So I had 3 phone calls with him, and I couldn't tell him why I was calling. Why? Because I didn't know. Because that thing in my gut had not been processed sufficiently so I could put it in English yet. It took 15 years for me to be able to articulate that. Just like it took 15 or 20 years for me to be able to articulate my rock and roll experience. So you've got these things in you that take a very long time to simmer on that back burner before they finally reach the level of articulation. But you're on a deadline with a book. You generally have about 5 years. and you have to come up with articulations to the best of your ability. So going over and over the same paragraph over 100 times, that gives you opportunity after opportunity after opportunity to just shave a little here, take a sentence apart and make it separate sentences. And if an idea is sufficiently important, turn it into a paragraph there. And in the process of doing the craft, your gut is working on the real craft, which is articulating the inarticulable, so that you can articulate things to people that others have never articulated before. Because that's your real job. You're contributing to the sandcastle of culture. You know how we dribble bits of sand and eventually they form a sandcastle? Well, if you and I are lucky, in this lifetime, we will be a dribble. We'll be a part of what builds the sandcastle of culture. And you're going to have far more impact if those little dribbles that you make are very, very new and unexpected.
It makes me think of, there's a chapter in the grand unified theory of everything in the universe, including the human soul.
Right, including sex, violence, and the human soul. Right.
Chapter 8754.
Aha!
Ideas are immortal.
Right.
How does this idea tie into the idea that ideas are immortal? Because I figure whatever it is you're sprinkling on top of that sandcastle, that inarticulable thing that you are articulating for the first time, is an idea that you are putting forth into the culture that people never had words for before.
Well, the guys like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle knew how this game is played, and it is a game, unfortunately. Each of them, well, Socrates didn't vie to be the greatest philosopher of his age. It was his publicist, Plato, who vied to make Socrates the greatest philosopher of his age. And Plato did it using a sneaky little thing that I call in one of my books the name game. That is, he picked all of the most famous men of Athens, and he concocted a dialogue between each of them and Socrates. Lord knows whether any of these dialogues actually took place, or whether or if Plato was simply a great publicist. And then Plato built Socrates as a giant, and he stood on the shoulders of the giant. And he aimed to be the greatest philosopher in Athens of his day. And there was a guy who went to school at Plato's Academy, who was actually an Auslander, a foreigner, a hick, a redneck, considering where he came from. And he set out to be the greatest philosopher of his day, and his name was Aristotle. Now, the process of positioning yourself as the greatest philosopher of the day is this. You help create a sandcastle, and you put yourself at the sandcastle's very top. And all the others, or almost all the others below you, are forgotten. But you manage to get across the gap in time before the next great philosopher of his time. Why? Because it takes fame to make you permanent, to make you immortal. So here you and I are in the ideas game, and we are competing with far more people than Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle could ever have conceived of. I mean, there are probably 100 million very, very good minds on this planet at this point. In their day, there were 30 or 40 other people you were competing against. And so the competition is all the more fierce. But look, when I was a kid, I was 10 years old. My parents, for reasons I do not know, had no interest in me at all. The other kids did have an interest in me, in snatching my hat and throwing it back and forth above my head between themselves, or chasing me around the block, or I was very popular as a target. So basically, the other kids didn't want to have anything to do with me either. And then a book appeared in my lap, in my family's great big living room in this little house opposite Delaware Park in a Frederick Olmsted Park. Another guy who made it over the course of time, Frederick Olmsted in Buffalo, New York, and a Frank Lloyd Wright house behind me, and behind our backyard. Another guy who made it to the top of the heap. And I opened the book and it said, the first two rules of science are these: the truth at any price, including the price of your life, and look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. And it totally mistold the story of Galileo to make point number one, the truth at any price, including the price of your life. But I needed that heroic vision of a guy who was willing to sacrifice his life for the truth. And the second example for look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, then proceed from there, was Anton von Leeuwenhoek, the inventor of the microscope. So two people had effectively reached out across a gap of 350 years and saved me, because suddenly I saw myself having a reason to live in those words. And I've been in science ever since. I went into microbiology and theoretical physics because of these two guys. My task is to reach out across the next 350 years and save the next lost kid. And so to do that, you have to be able to climb to the very top of the sand pile. And Jacob, I'm nowhere near having done that. Nowhere at all.
Talking about this idea of fame being a necessary component of this is interesting, because especially when I think of the context, not necessarily in science, but although it is relevant, but in the context of art, there's this constant struggle of the need to create things and then the need to promote the things, to get things in the world, to put yourself up there, to be able to get to the top of that sandcastle. How do you think about the contrast between those two things versus spending the time to work and refine these ideas, to articulate the inarticulable, but then also needing to spend the time to actually get those ideas out there into the world, especially like you said, in a world that where now ideas are so abundant that it's becoming even harder to break through?
Well, I don't have the time to do it. And look, I could get on the phone with you and tell you why Prince was absolutely crucial to his time way back then. And I could persuade you of that because I completely believed in Prince or John Mellencamp or Billy Idol or Joan Jett, these people I helped build. And then once I started working with him, with Michael Jackson, who I believed in to the depths of my soul, because he was the truth at any price, including the price of your life, and look at things right under your noses if you've never seen them before, personified in a way I had never imagined in my life. So I could do that for other people. I deeply believed in many of my clients in the rock and roll business. But you cannot get on the phone with somebody and say, hi, Channel 4 TV says I'm the Einstein, Newton, Darwin, and Freud of the 21st century. Want to interview me? No, that sounds like you are an utter moron. Not only that, you are an obnoxious moron. So I can't do that for myself. And I have to really concentrate on writing these books and simply publicizing them to the best of my ability under the circumstances. But my primary task is not publicizing my books. I'm about to be 82 in June. Life is shorter than we'd like it to be. I'm up against the deadline of death. And I have 2 more books that I have to write. One of them is The Grand Unified Theory of Everything in the Universe, including Sex, Violence, and the Human Soul. And the book after that is Who Killed Omnology? And omnology is the kind of science that Erasmus Darwin and that I'm always blanking on his name these days, that Alexander von Humboldt pursued. And it was killed by this establishment of the research university that I've talked about. And I want to know the details of exactly how, because one of the things I want to leave behind when I go, and something we were going to start a course in as soon as we can get our act together at Kepler Space University, where I'm a professor of practice, is omnology. We want to be able to teach you how to think outside of the silos so you can get a grand look above the silos and see the big pictures that emerge when you take that perspective.
There are many different threads I can pull on based off that one answer. There's a lot of paths we can go down. I did want to ask, specifically when it comes to Michael, you said how he has the ability, and you have to forgive me, I don't know the rules off the top of my head the way you know the 2 rules, but his ability to look at anything under his nose with like this sense of awe and wonder. And last time I spoke to you, you told me this story of when I think he was reading a press release that you wrote.
Yeah, I was reading him a press release that I had written.
And he was able to see awe in the tiniest of things listening to this press release. And I'm curious, in your opinion, what was it about the press release that invoked that in him? Like, I'm looking like tactically, like what in your writing was he seeing Like not necessarily the feeling, but the writing itself.
I have been working on my writing since I was 14 years old. And I've worked very obsessively on it. And I used to read 2 books a day when I was a kid. Science books, science fiction books. And I was the editor and art director of the Washington Square Review, which is New York University's literary magazine. And I won all kinds of plaudits for that. So I have written poetry. I used to write a lot of it. Don't write much anymore. My poetry is all buried in my prose. And I've been all through literature. I took a course that was extremely useful in French because I used to be fluent in French. I was called one of the top 2 French students in the United States. And I took a course called Exercices du Style, Exercises in Style. And in that course, you take the works of one of the great French writers, you figure out the elements of his style, and then you write in the manner of that great writer. And then you move on to the next great writer and do the same thing all over again, learning trick after trick of sentence construction and how to balance things and how to put things in parallel so they read smoothly to the reader. And it was all of those tiny, an increment, again, the sandcastle, a drop-by-drop increment of 20 years or something like that, 25 years, 30 years, I forget what it was, of work on this. And nobody else ever saw it. Michael, he didn't see it in the terms in which I would put it, but he saw it anyway. And it floored him. It floored him. I told you, since we have the benefit of TV here, he started out like, no, it won't work. Like this in his seat. And then he slumped and slumped and slumped and slumped and his mouth opened further and further. And he said, wow, did you write that? It was an amazing experience. No one would ever see that in my writing before I started writing books.
There's no chance you still have that press release, is there?
No, there's no chance because I had purchased a little thing called a TRS 100 on my way to the airport to go to my first Jackson's rehearsal, which I think was in Memphis. And that's when I got started with computers. The computer languages have changed over the years. And the big change was there was a change in 1991 when I had to make a decision about whether I was going to go with Windows or go with Apple. And I called the people I knew in publishing and they all said Microsoft Windows is what they used. So I went with Windows. And then there were God knows what other changes. The language that I had been working in was called CP/M. One of my friends from the New York Times called. He was their gadget editor, their computer editor. And he said, CP/M's going to be around forever. Just don't worry about a thing. Stick with CP/M. Have you ever heard of CP/M? No. Okay. And even when I talk to people who allegedly take floppies and convert them to digital files, they haven't heard of CP/M. So much for that. So over the course of the years, in all of these computer changes, an awful lot of my work has gone. And my wife also took all of my writing at one point and threw it out. So a lot of my work just doesn't exist in any form we can find. Although somebody did find an old Prince press release. I was on my letterhead with my logo, my company's logo, the whole thing, the Howard Bloom Organization, Ltd. So no, too much goes, and that's why I'm trying to be very careful about storage. And thank God Carbonite came into existence 10 years ago. And thank God Dropbox helps you back up your stuff. And I'm paranoid about losing stuff now.
That idea of you learned your style by mimicking the styles of others is really interesting. Is there anything else you did to quote unquote work on your writing? Like the idea of practice as a creative person is always interesting. It's not necessarily like basketball where I'm not good at 3-point shooting. Let me go take a bunch of 3-point shots. Like it's a lot more abstract than that when it comes to practice as a creative person. So is there any other ways you've thought about approaching it other than just copying the style of other artists?
I don't have time anymore. I have to take the style that I've invented and keep making it better if I can. But I pretty much worked out the kinks. Parallelisms when they're not set up properly, when you want to say, and Ulysses picked up his shield, picked up his sword, picked up his helmet, and went off to war. There are 3 parallel ideas there. Picked up his sword, picked up his helmet, picked up his, I forget what else I said, but putting those in parallel form, because often you will jumble the wording so it's different for each of those 3 elements, and you'll destroy the reader's ability to smoothly read that sentence. The other is chopping up the sentence. That's a wicked one, because it turns out you are hiding in the middle of a sentence big ideas. And those big ideas you need to yank out of that sentence and turn into, if necessary, 2 pages on their own. Slim down those sentences, for God's sakes. Have a subject, a verb, a noun, a verb, and whatever the noun and verb are acting on. And make it active. I mean, there was a book called Shrunk on Style that my best friend in high school and I, both of whom the other kids wanted to have nothing to do with, latched on to, he would go off to Harvard and Yale, but both of them, Yale Law School and Harvard undergrad. So at any rate, we latched onto this book that we knew colloquially as Shrunk on Style. I forget what the formal title is. And whatever it was, it said, don't use passive verbs. May use active verbs. Do not say, the baseball was slammed into the air by his powerful blow. Say, he batted the baseball powerfully into the air. Make the person doing the action, put him at the beginning or her at the beginning of the sentence, so that you can have an active sentence rather than a sentence that's gobbledygook that the reader has to decipher. Because anything the reader has to decipher is slowing the reader down, and you want the reader to go through simultaneously an emotional rush and a logical rush, all at the same time. And if you hinder him in any way, or her, whoever your reader is, you are doing yourself and the reader a tremendous disservice. Make the reading frictionless. And use colorful words. And use colloquialisms. Written language and spoken language are 2 radically different languages. And you understand that if you ever ask somebody to do a transcript for you of an interview. And you read it, and it reads to a certain extent like gibberish. Because the spoken language that we understand so clearly is so very different from written language. So I had to invent, with the help of looking at other authors who were good at this, a way of writing to you that sounded as if you and I were having coffee across the table from each other. In other words, sounded colloquial and exciting, but in reality was not formal language. I had to throw that away. That's garbage as far as I'm concerned. It's an offense to humanity. And I had to invent a language that sounded colloquial and chatty. But if you compare it to a transcript, the transcript's in an entirely different language.
Does the style change depending on the type of book? Like whether it's fiction versus nonfiction, whether it's self-help versus science, like should your approach as a writer change?
I think it has to, because if you're writing fiction, that's a whole different proposition. And you're writing characters. And I don't mean characters as in ABC. I mean, you're writing vivid human beings who have never seemingly existed before. And those human beings take you over. And they start writing themselves. But you still need the simplicity of prose that gets across ideas in strong terms. And you need to be able to vividly describe your settings so that the reader can feel himself being in that setting. And these are basically elements of the same thing that I try to use in my book. I also try, when I can, and I don't do as much as I would like, to tell you the color of the room, the character of the furniture, things like that. It's very important to root the reader, to make the reader feel like a camera in the room. Not just a camera, but a participant at a camera simultaneously.
When it comes to something like scientific writing, could emotion sway the opinion of the person reading it? Like if you're presenting facts and theories, should emotion be involved in that? And unethical might not be the right word, but can you leverage the power of emotion to sway someone to believe in your opinion, even if the facts don't necessarily line up, but you can use emotion to get them there?
Well, no, even if the facts don't line up, you can't. It's not right. It's not moral. It's not ethical. It's not honest. It's not the truth at any price, including the price of your life. But if you have the facts lined up, you have to give the emotion. I mean, what is powering? Science has been taken over by climate change, and science these days doesn't consist primarily of explaining how something came to be. It consists these days of explaining how something awful can be linked to climate change. That's a mandate in science. That's not a hypothesis anymore. That's considered an absolute imperative. Well, because at the extreme end of climate change are the people who want to do away with all modern industrial technology, period, and want to take us back to the realm of the oxen and the plow, literally. They are getting across their argument with incredible emotion by calling on your fear that, oh my God, the planet is about to end. We're about to destroy the whole thing. My God, we're going to kill ourselves off in the process. That is a profoundly emotional argument, and it remains unstated to a large extent because there are ways to call on it, because it's become so powerfully rooted in our culture. And yes, there are problems. Climate change has been with us since this planet first formed from a bunch of planetesimals, a bunch of rocks gathering together in gravity balls 4.5 billion years ago. This has been a planet of climate catastrophe. And this book argues that, yes, we do, in all probability, need to decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But that may be a hapless cause because there's been as much as 1,000 times as much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere in the past, generated by guess who? Not by modern industrial man. Modern industrial man was not around yet. Generated by nature, by the processes we call nature. So we have to, if reducing the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is the first step toward developing climate stabilization technologies in general, ways that we can, should we wish, and this is a totally anthropogenic thing, if we wish to stabilize the climate the way it was in 1650 or 1750 before the Industrial Revolution, though the Industrial Revolution was well underway by 1850. But if we choose to do that, that's great. And if we choose to keep the climate at that level for the rest of our existence on this planet, that's terrific. We're going to need that. Because the next ice age on this particular planet, or the next global warming, and I mean a global warming that puts this global warming to shame, a global warming where tropical animals and plants can live at the South Pole, which is what they did 55 million years ago. We're going to need to fend that off one way or the other. So reduction of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is just one of the tools we're going to have to develop. And in the book, I call for the use of space solar power, putting massive solar power farms not on the ground where we wipe out whole terrestrial ecosystems, but in space, and beaming the power down using electromagnetic waves to the Earth, and getting rid of all, and taking us to net zero, getting rid of all of the emissions created by fossil fuels, because all the fossil fuels could be replaced with the use of space solar power. And there have to be other modalities. There have to be other ways of stabilizing the climate, because, that's our task on this earth. We've given ourselves that task without realizing it. And it goes totally against nature, because nature is a wild mother of all fluctuations. And those fluctuations can be vast and disastrous. I mean, 99% of the species who ever lived are gone. And they were not killed off by mankind. They were killed off by guess who? That loving, comforting, harmonious, harmony-seeking Mother Nature. Well, I'm sorry, Mother Nature does not seek harmony. Nature hates an equilibrium. Nature hates a fine-tuned balance.
We've drifted a little bit from the writing process, but I do think I should ask one follow-up question to that before we move on. Then
Well,
move back, I guess.
let me throw something in there. We haven't deviated from the writing process because as a writer, you are soaked in the tea of your time. You are soaked in the issues of your time. And even when you don't know it, you are speaking a position on those influences. So the writing process is a matter of opening yourself. Look, when I was 16, I'm very into poetry, very into it. 2 poems came along that have shaped the rest of my life. And one of them was by Edna St. Vincent Millay. It was called Renaissance. And it said, if you want to see the infinite in the tiniest of things, you have to come to understand and feel within yourself the suffering of every kind of person in every kind of culture on this planet. And that's soaking the tea bag of yourself in the liquid of the culture of your time, and not just your own culture, other cultures as well. And I felt that was my obligation since the age of 16. So part of the writing process is your experience, and it's on you to make that experience as adventurous and wide and as much tunneling in to other things other people don't see that are around you all the time, and tunneling into foreign ways of seeing things. It's as much about that as it is about the words you put down on paper, because that's the environment. That's your internal environment is formed by how you take in the culture around you.
And so it's your responsibility as a writer to experience as much as you can in order to reflect it on the page. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes.
I understand you're an omnologist, but do you above all else identify as a writer?
That's hard to say, because as an omnologist, all the things that I do are facets of each other. My primary obligation is insight. My primary obligation is to show you the universe and where you fit within it and how you contribute to its purposes. So, and this book does that in a radically, radically different way from anything I've ever seen in my life. And that's my obligation, is to see things from points of view that other people simply don't.
What does the initial idea for a book like this look like? This is, correct me if I'm wrong, but this is very contrarian to a lot of the current scientific thinking. So where does
everything I write is contrarian. I'm a deliberate heretic.
And so what does that initial idea look like? What's the spark? What does that look like in your mind when the seedling of this idea is planted?
Well, as I told you, at the lunch table, it was the realization that, hey, stars are materialist as hell. They gather more tons, quintillions of tons of material, and they battle each other to see who can gather the most. And some stars end up eating smaller protostars in the process. It's a dog-eat-dog, except it's a star-eat-star world up there. That was the first inkling. And then the second inkling came when I was asked to do that thing at New Paltz, and the case of the sexual cosmos suddenly occurred to me. But here's an instance that'll answer the question much better. On a previous book, I had sold a book called Reinventing Capitalism, Putting Soul in the Machine, now known as The Genius of the Beast, to a publisher. And then the crash of 2008 came along. And my publisher said, well, can you write me a chapter to put at the beginning of the book on the crash of 2008? So I was in Buffalo, my hometown, with my family for Passover. And sitting on my left was a cousin who ran research and development for Ross Wyatt Labs for a long time and now has his own drug company. And on my left was a cousin who was one of the pioneers in using great big hulking computers to visualize what a macromolecule, a really big biological molecule, looks like. And the two areas were converging. In other words, by visualizing a giant hunking molecule, you could see where there was a little point, a little hole, where you could dock something and change the operation of the molecule and of the cell in which it lived. And I suddenly had an idea having to do with certain bacteria. I had it in a flash. And so a few days later, I got back to New York City and started to write the idea down. The idea that I'd had in a flash turned out to be 3 chapters, turned out to be roughly 100 pages of material. So how you have a flash of something that unfolds as 100 pages is beyond me, but you do sometimes.
Why did you wait a few days to write the idea down? Why didn't you write it down right away?
I probably wrote something down to remind myself, because my memory, and if all human memories, are incredibly fickle and unreliable. And if you don't write things down, they're gone.
So in that instance, you knew exactly what it was you wanted to write. Well, you had the flash, you knew exactly what you were going to write. How do you then kind of like take that idea from your head and put it onto the page? Because sometimes what the idea is in your mind and what it actually looks like in reality on the page can end up being, there's a growing pains that occur when you try to do that. So what does that process look like of nurturing an idea and getting it out of your head and onto the page?
Well, the first thing is, because I write in science, because science is who I am, it's been who I am since the age of 10. The first thing is to start digging into the research to make sure that your idea is valid. And then you can start writing up the research and writing up the topic sentences that came out of your grand idea. Because the idea is in part a stance. Like the stance in this book, The Case of the Sexual Cosmos, is a stance that's very different from the stance anybody else I know of is taking. It is not an anti-climate science stance. It's an anti-apocalyptic thinking stance. It's a stance based on hope. And it's a stance based on an infatuation with gadgets that I've had since I co-designed my first computer when I was 12 and built my first Boolean algebra, symbolic logic machine, when I was 12. You know, if you took my technology away, there would be no more me, period. So those are emotional stances. You have to be true to the stance that you're taking and see where it fits in, how you want to persuade people in the culture that it's a valid stance. And people find this book liberating. I have one friend who's the head of 2 major psychological societies, psychotherapeutic societies, who reads a bit of it every day. I have another friend who, poor baby, he's a Democrat like me, but he works for Fox TV writing news copy. And whenever he feels down, he picks up the book and reads a few pages just to reinvigorate himself. And all of that comes out of taking an emotional stance and figuring out over the course of a lot of time how to get it across in a way that will be persuasive within the construct of our current society and the things that it demonizes so easily. This book could easily have been demonized as climate denial. It's not. It's not. I'm not a climate denier. I'm a climate amplifier. I want you to understand how appallingly up and down the climate has been since the beginnings of the planet 4.5 billion years ago, so that you can see that our task is much bigger than just to stop man-made gases. Nature's not going to be nice to us if we clear the path for her, because nature has never been nice. Again, nature killed off that 99% of all the species who have ever lived. Yes, she invented them, which is astonishing, but then she threw them away. And nature did this with huge, unbelievable climate change. So you have to figure out how to nuance within the structures of approval and disapproval within your own society, and where to take a stance that people are going to disapprove of if it's necessary, despite them, but without losing your readers for the book. So I'm trying to save humanity and nature, but nature's nature is to constantly reinvent and to constantly discard and to constantly kill with bizarre things like tornadoes and hurricanes and earthquakes, and all these things existed long before humans came along. Does all of this make sense to you?
I think it makes sense. I think I am very much somewhat out of my depth in a conversation, especially when it comes to climate change. Like, I don't know a ton about it. And so I'm hesitant to ask a question because I know I'm aware enough of my ignorance on the topic that I know that I might not be able to bring a level of nuance to this conversation. But a two-pronged question, I guess, to kind of like do my due diligence in terms of as an interviewer is, one, is there a human impact on the climate happening at all? And I think you're saying that you're not denying that is the case, but I just want to confirm that there is in fact a human impact.
Yeah, we can find human impact from Roman society in ice cores in Greenland.
Second question, when you're doing the due diligence, you said one thing, you're kind of coming from a place of trying to provide hope. And also earlier you said you're fiercely against, not apocalyptic thinking. What was the...
Well, it is apocalyptic thinking.
But so how do you make sure when you're validating an idea like this that you don't let your own emotions cloud the research you're doing into a topic like this?
Well, as much as scientists talk about objectivity, there's no such thing as a thoroughly objective human being. And your own emotional proclivities are always going to shape the way you see things, but you have to do your research like crazy to see if you're right. And very often you can be wrong. And then you have to step back and figure out how you're going to proceed from that point onward. And for example, I was absolutely convinced that the amount of biostuff on this planet has increased during the dominion of human beings. Why? We spend a good part of, we used to spend, 95% of us used to spend all days from sunrise to sunset, taking care of the needs of plants. We fed them the things that they most enjoyed. We call them fertilizers. We made sure that they had water. We put up fences to keep raiders that would eat them away, like bunny rabbits and deer. We did everything in our power to create a paradise for plants. And in our obsession with this for the last 11,000 years, I was certain that the amount of green stuff on this planet had increased. Now, it took 2 years at least, maybe 3, to research this. And at the end of the 3 years, I was stuck with a basic conclusion. The kinds of plants that accumulate huge amounts of biomass, forests, trees, because we've taken down a lot of those, the biomass has not gone up under the sway of human beings. So I thought, okay, how am I going to get around this? This is not, there's no way around it. The fact is that what I thought was true isn't true. And then I realized it's the amount of sapience, it's the amount of sentience, it's the amount of living, breathing beings, perceiving and feeling, and in the case of humans, accumulating those feelings, generation after generation after generation, that was our unique gift, has been our unique gift, not just to this planet, but to the cosmos, because we are creating things the cosmos has never seen before. And this is a cosmos that rewards those who oppose her, that rewards those who overcome her obstacles, that rewards those who invent ways beyond, over, under, and beyond her obstacles. And we have just created a whole new toolbox of things that never existed before, capabilities that never existed before, for the cosmos within which we live.
You mentioned how you still have a lot of work to go and do. And as you've been describing this book and as I've been reading the book, I see how much work has gone into it as you're talking about here. You also mentioned earlier how you're turning 82 in just over a month. You talked about death is an unavoidable thing. What keeps you going? Why are you still working this hard at 81 years old?
I'm doing it for that kid 350 years from now. And Jacob, a strange thing has happened over the last 20 years or so. I started a file to cheer me up when I get down. And until the last 5 years or so, I used to get down and suicidal sometimes every day of the week. And I figured, okay, if I keep all the nice things people say about me in a file, I can turn to that file when I'm feeling that I'm of no use to another human being. And now that file is about 550 pages long. And in it, person after person after person says, I read your, and then fill in the name of the book, when I was 16 years old. And I didn't have a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning until then. And all of a sudden you gave me a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning. And in some cases, the letters say, and now I'm 36 years old. And those senses of purpose and meaning that you gave me are still powering me through my life. So while I'm trying to reach that kid 350 years down the road, I'm apparently reaching kids who are my contemporaries, almost my contemporaries, 20, 40 years younger than I am, sometimes 50. So at any rate, so that part is working. We put together a thing called the Howard Bloom Institute, and its specific purpose is to give my work visibility after I am gone to try to carry on my way of thought. Now, it's a little rinky-dink gang, sort of like Robin Hood's Gang of Merry Men, except it includes a lot of women. And we'll see if it can achieve its purpose. But I'm trying with all that's in me to reach that kid 350 years down the road. And I'm trying to write the books I feel are necessary because my way of looking at things, which is totally contrarian and totally heretical, is going to die. I mean, even if just my strength to do this thinking goes, and I remain a doddering old man, it will still disappear. And I've got to capture as much as I can of this way of thinking while I'm still alive for the sake, not just of the kids 350 years from now, but for the sake of the kids who've read my work and have been saved by it, and the kids who are now reaching the age of 16 who might read my work and be saved by it. Does that make any sense?
That does make sense. Is it a selfish or selfless pursuit to do this?
It's both. It's incredibly selfish. It's incredibly egotistical. And at the same time, it's trying to do the most selfless thing that I could ever do. Because, well, another phrase from my work, opposites are joined at the hip. The egomaniacal and the altruistic are joined at the hip in the case of some people. And I'm one of those people.
I'm going to ask you my last question so you can get on with your work here. And this is the last question that I ask everybody at the end of every interview. And it is, what does it mean to you to do art well?
Oh, it means the world. To see a full-page review of one of my books in the Washington Post and see the author say at 3 different places, the writing is beautiful. The same thing that Michael Jackson said. That is it warms you in ways that I cannot describe. It's warming me right now in ways I cannot describe. When a piece of art is at its best, when it feels as if it wrote itself through you, that you didn't write it because it's so perfect. Now, I don't know if I ever achieved that in my books, but I'm certainly, I have achieved it in my writing little tiny parables. And when they're absolutely right, it feels like you were just the vehicle. And I try to have that as much as possible in my writing. When I work like a maniac to perfect it, and by perfecting it, I mean to make it gleam, to make it jump, to make it soar, to make it dive, to make it take you places, and emotionally and, as I said, logically, all at the same time.
Howard, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you for coming back on the podcast. Before I let you go, I know at the time of this recording, the book is not out yet, but this will be released on May the 5th.
Aha. There's a chance the book will be out.
It'll be out. So, if it's not out, I'll be updating the description what it is. But in the event that it is out, where can people find your book?
Amazon. Go to Amazon.
And the name of the book one more time?
It's The Case of the Sexual Cosmos. Everything you know about nature is wrong.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast. And if you enjoyed my interview with Howard and want to pick up a copy of his book, The Case for the Sexual Cosmos, Everything You Know About Nature is Wrong, I'll be sure to link it in the show notes down below. And if you want even more from me, make sure to subscribe to the Artwell newsletter. And now, go do your thing. And whatever it is, do it well.